All right, welcome to Sobremesa. This is our first show for the semester. My name is Ruben Maya, and I'm here with my co-host Jake Clore. Hi, Jake.
Good morning.
With us today, we have Professor Nicole Trujillo-Pagan, and I know when we were in your office last week, or was it this week? I can't even. It was last
flies,
week. Yeah, time flies. We were kind of trying to pinpoint a typical a topic or a theme to talk about today, but I know
There's so much to talk about.
There's so much to talk about.
Oh my God, the Latino
these days.
community is
Yeah.
just, there's so much going on, whether it be with culture or, our celebrities and, of course, immigration. So, but I think we were talking about gender identity, right? Because
Right.
everybody has one.
Yeah, but before we get to those topics, how about you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Oh, thanks. Well, so my name is Nicole Trujillo-Pagan. I'm originally from New York. I'm Puerto Rican and Mexican in background. And it's interesting because we're having, I think, sort of return to the migration politics that I faced when I was a kid, right? My mom was a migrant an undocumented migrant from Mexico back in the 70s. I know it's a long time, you guys.
No.
But trust me, it's still within possible realm of lifetimes. Anyway, so it was very interesting, to go through that period, when I'm very young and, not even a teenager and really worry about her. We would see movies, for example, about raids. And so when she would go off to work, she would work recovering a lot of buildings that had experienced a fire. And I guess she's really on my mind. I must tell you, she passed away last Saturday. I know we didn't talk about that. I didn't plan on talking about this, but it's important to me because I've been thinking a lot about immigration and that fear that I went through when I was a kid. And here she was sacrificing herself, right, for her family, working in a job that potentially contributed to the breast cancer that caused her recent passing. And so here we are, and I find it really kind of poignant that we're at a similar political moment, and it's so painful for people across the country and really our entire families. It's not just a question of who's being deported, remember, right? This is about families, people who are citizens. We're talking about mixed status households, our parents, our grandparents, our aunts. Our families are really feeling it across the country. I know I was telling you outside, something has me really alarmed is yesterday I heard the news, arrests are up 900% in New York for deportation from last year. That's extreme, and it's New York. That's where I come from. So to hear that kind of fear and force is really kind of scary.
Right, I believe you talked about someone that got the news that they were going to get deported. They committed suicide. Is that what you said?
That happened yesterday. I think it was in California, an undocumented youth. Certainly, what do you guys think? We're talking about people your age. Think about Florida. It just feels like there's a lot of youth really feeling a lot of pain because this guy, what happened was he's hearing about so many deportations. Whether it be LA, Texas, New York, you name it. And there's so much fear in our communities that in his suicide note, he died yesterday, he committed suicide. He said he was just really panicked and scared of being deported because he had grown up in this country. He could not get, DACA, or I don't know if it had expires, but he was out of status. And so here he's thinking, I don't know anybody in Mexico. If I get deported, what am I going to do my entire life that I've lived here? I can't imagine what that's like, it's worse than being a refugee because it's not even like you feel like you have a political cause. It's like you've gutted your life,
Right, and now once those people get deported, once you're deported from the U.S., can you apply to come back?
No, actually, there's a ban on your ability to re-enter for 10 years because you were here illegally. So,
okay, yeah.
And the problem is that now, as administrations have become more enforcement-centered, not only do you have a ban from entering, but if you get detained trying to attempt to re-enter the United States, then you're incarcerated.
Right, and we also got to think about the kids, right? So if you entered illegally as a parent and had a child, the child is American, and if they deport you, you're leaving your family behind as well.
Yeah, and that's really a big problem when you're talking about, minor children. That's why people are really terrified. I can't imagine what that would be like. I have a 6-year-old daughter. If all of a sudden I couldn't be with her, I couldn't make sure she was okay.
Mm-hmm.
you know, I mean, you're talking about a lot of poor families too, you know, and so
Right.
it's not like you have the kind of resources where maybe I can, I don't know, enroll her in a boarding school. I mean, those options wouldn't be available to me. So
Exactly.
you're already talking about a vulnerable population in fear, and then this really concerted attack on a daily level. So it's not just what is actually happening in our neighborhoods. For example, this morning, I already had 2 emails about ICE doing raids within Southwest Detroit. So it's not just that daily, you know, pressure and stress. It's, you just can't get away from it. Every time you turn on the news, it's happening all over the country.
Right. Yeah.
So one of the topics we wanted to talk about was your research, and we read a little bit about what you're currently researching, and you're focusing on Detroit. So
Yeah.
what have you found in studying Latino identity in Detroit that is related to?
So I got to tell you, I love the question of Latinos in the Midwest, right? Because we hear so much about the Latino population in the Southwest, right? Our Mexican population and Chicanos, and they've made such a history for themselves. And of course, being a New Yorker, right, of Puerto Rican background, got this. But there's something so interesting that happens in the Midwest, right? Where this industrialization brought people from Puerto Rico and from, you know, Mexico, but also Cubans and waves of refugees that government tried to funnel away from major cities. And what you find is a really interesting Latino melting pot, if you will, right? You think about some neighborhoods in Chicago that has Puerto Ricans and Mexicans that live literally back to back in separate neighborhoods.
Right.
So that's fascinating to me. Why are they living in separate neighborhoods? We share similar foods. We share at least compatible. You know, we can speak the same language. We say the same. We share the same media sources, and yet there's still some kind of separateness. So the question of Latinos in Detroit, of course, is particularly fascinating to me because you can't look at a map of Detroit and not, you know, feel appalled at hyper-segregation. Look at how this is the largest black majority city in the United States, and yet we're surrounded by some of the whitest towns in the United States and one of the richest counties in the United States. So how does that happen? You know, as a city we're so poor and the suburbs are so rich and white. Well, what happens to Latinos that are literally on the border, right? We're right next to the largest Arab population in the world. We live in a black majority city, and yet we have to navigate our lives oddly on a U.S. national border. How does that happen? It's just fascinating. And so what I've been doing is interviewing youth about how do they see the American dream now. I mean, think about everything we just talked about. How do you see opportunity and mobility today? A lot of people talk about millennials feeling disenchanted about the possibilities of the future. I mean, I don't know. How do you guys feel about your future?
Well, I know a lot of people are about our age feel like the American dream either doesn't exist or it's far different from what it was supposed to be a couple decades ago, or maybe several decades ago. From my perspective as a Mexican, I think just coming to the U.S., it's definitely there's definitely more opportunities that coming from Mexico, but there's a lot of that social pressure that you were talking about. Can my family get deported at some point? You know, there's a lot of like unwanted or unnecessary social pressure that we have to fight through every single day. So put that on top of like all the other pressure living in like the world of information, how everything is extra competitive.
Yeah.
In school, in work. I don't know how I feel about the American dream anymore. I mean, if it's there, it's I guess it's harder to reach now than it was several decades ago. I don't know how you feel about it, Jake.
Well, my question is it worth achieving?
So
Yeah, go ahead.
Should we change what we think about as the American dream? Because we study, I've studied other countries. Like, I just watched this documentary, Michael Moore. People love him, people hate him. But he has this documentary where he goes to other countries and studies what they do better than America. And one of the big things I think is just lifestyle is more comfortable. America is probably the biggest, it's definitely the most powerful country in the world, arguably an empire. Do you think it would be enjoyable to live in a place like that, or is the American dream kind of pushing us towards just living lives that are feeding some sort of machine rather than
Some consumption. Yeah, the challenge there, though, I'm sure Moore pointed it out because he's so, you know, classic for I guess, emphasizing that European countries take care of their citizens. They have a much higher, tax base, and so they're able to do things like socialized medicine. Here in the United States, we have rates of inequality that are worse than India. We have, in fact, people in this country who live in conditions that are worse than many third world countries. And that to me is shocking. I'm sure many Detroiters can understand this. I mean, they're not people who are here at the university.
Right.
But we live in these neighborhoods. And so I feel like when we talk about the American dream, certainly having like the European dream would be ideal. But we live in a country where the American dream means, I want to escape from poverty, please. I definitely don't want to, have to live on, SNAP and carbohydrates for the rest of my life. I'd like some fruit and vegetables. Sometimes the American dream can be literally that simple, but it's very real to most people. And I got to say, for guys, you're both, at some point in your life, going to feel like you have to provide for others, right? Isn't that part of like the masculine identity?
Right, yeah.
So it becomes that much more of a challenge.
Thank you for mentioning that.
but one thing I want to say about Latinos is, we have this idea that you can't be all doom and gloom, right? So as a sociologist, I think a lot about the things that worry me. But I know my mother would say that you have a responsibility to the people around you to smile and figure out a way to make it happen. And that's why I'm excited about this project. Because, here in this context that is so challenged for thinking about the American dream, I know that Latinos are doing things that we haven't paid attention to. And those kinds of stories are the ones that help us think about how to be... I don't know what the word is. It's not about struggle. It's about how we overcome. It's the sort of perennial story about how humans can make a better life for themselves. And it's not necessarily attached to the American dream. I agree with you, Jake. But that's why we need to do this study.
Yeah, I know when I came to the U.S., in middle school, we would have like these large conferences, and the principal would go in and he would tell everyone, you can be whatever you want to be. That is the American dream here. And I every day I just keep thinking back to that, and I'm like, that's not necessarily true. I mean, first of all, I think it's more realistic that you're probably going to become what you're good at if they're hiring for that, right? It's not like, oh, I'm good at this, so I'm gonna study really hard and I'm gonna become that profession. There has to be that. It's more competitive nowadays, but there also has to be like this. Availability, which I don't think we have much of these days. I feel like more people are thinking, how am I going to survive? They're thinking, how am I going to pass this test instead of learning, right? They're thinking, how am I going to provide for my kids instead of like worrying about, they're just worrying about stuff that we shouldn't be worrying about in this life. I feel like in countries like Italy, like you mentioned in that documentary, I know Michael Moore makes this point where like in Italy, they get 2 months of vacation, and that's why they're the happiest people on earth, right? It's like whenever you go to Italy, and the thing that amazes me more is that when they leave their work, here in the U.S., when you leave your work, you can still get emails from your students, or you can still get emails from other faculty members. But in Italy, they have this like special server where like as soon as you leave work, you're offline. No emails will get to you. Like they really take care of their employees over there. So. Yeah.
Yeah, it's definitely one of those things where it makes you think, should we be living differently? And I think...
More cooperatively. I mean, notice that Italy has, I think it's really exciting what they're doing with a lot of their squatters. So coming from, the Lower East Side, something I can tell you is that New York in the 70s looked a lot like Detroit. We had a lot of, buildings that were being burned so that the landlord could collect on insurance. And being in the Lower East Side, a lot of Puerto Ricans were like, what are we going to do? We got nothing, We're living in public housing. This is terrible. But then there were all these abandoned lots, and we thought, hey, why don't we recreate Puerto Rico in this cold, frosty New York City? And we developed these community gardens, these places that were gated off, but literally they would create pathways right into the ground and plant all kinds of things and put a little caseta, a little sort of hut in the back. And the guys would come in the summer and they put out these, tables and play cards or play dominoes with their guayaberas, like old time. And the women would sit there with their thermoses of coffee, and it just created this feeling, of community. Yeah, we didn't have anything, but we had each other. And so it made, now you can't go out in New York without dropping at least $100. So I remember these times where we really invested a lot of sweat equity in our neighborhoods, And now you go back to those neighborhoods. And I, who is above the median income in the United States, could not afford an apartment where I grew up. part of what gave those spaces that value was all the work we did cooperatively. And that's what Italy is doing. I mean, think about how hard it is to afford an apartment in Rome. They're doing the same thing, squatting and rebuilding neighborhoods.
A lot of these things that we try to work towards, like an expensive apartment, a nice car, things like that, is that something that we should be doing? Or do you think that aspect of the American dream is something that's being sold to us, just the idea that we should want these things?
I don't know. Do you feel like you want something different? What do you feel like you want?
Yeah, like when you asked me how I felt about the American dream, that's one thing that I've been thinking about a lot. Are these things like a car, an expensive house, are those going to make me happy, or are things like what you said, sweat equity?
Yeah.
Is that something that's going to make me, more fulfilled in life? Is that?
I don't know about you, but definitely for me. No, yeah, you're right. I mean, I'm going into the nursing profession, and yes, I love science, and yes, I think I will like becoming a nurse one day. But in the back of my head, I hate this feeling that I feel like I have to go into the health field because it's a sustainable job. In the back of your head, you have to think about what is going to sustain me for the rest of my life instead of pursuing maybe your actual dream, We keep talking about this American dream, but what is my dream, my personal dream?
And that's a problem that I have, that so many of us feel that we have to accommodate the economy.
Exactly.
As it exists. And yet we know, right? Only a couple of weeks ago, it could be radically disrupted by a 1,700 point fall in the market. Right now, everybody is concerned about what the effect might be on the economy. So we're trying to accommodate this ever-changing animal rather than this animal trying to accommodate itself to us. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah.
I think that's a good way to put it. So maybe to transition a little bit, Ruben wants to be a male nurse, as he mentioned. And now we can move into gender identity, I guess.
Men in non-traditional fields. What?
That is
How
so
does
true.
That feel?
That is so true. How does
it feel as a man to be a nurse? Like when you go to nursing classes or events, what's that experience like?
Well, I haven't experienced it yet. Just I will experience that in the fall. But going through the application process and all that stuff, talking to counselors at different schools, they all tell me the same thing. It's like, you're probably gonna be the minority when you go to these classes. Most of the classes are filled by females. So they, from my point of view, I look at it as actually a positive thing because I think we need both male and female perspectives on the field. If you're only getting the female perspective in this field, I feel like you're kind of missing them. Maybe what a male could have thought about in a special situation. I mean, just like any other field, I feel like there should be a balance between female and male workers.
And men can be caring nurturers too, right?
Yeah, I hate that thing. I hate that thing when you, like, for example, watch TV commercials, and I don't know why they always do this to men, but men have, like, the husband has to be like the person that doesn't care about their kids, and they have to dumb down the men. And when you have shows like The Simpsons, Homer, he sucks at his job. All he does is drink beer with his friends, right? He doesn't care about his kids or his family.
He doesn't even want to go home.
Right, and you got Family Guy too. All this sitcoms. What do we like? What does America like to see in their husbands? Is like the husband that goes and plays out with the boys, but he doesn't really care about his family. I feel like we're teaching young people like kind of like a wrong perspective on how to look at the male. I do understand that this may be a backlash though, because back in like the 1940s, 1950s, we used to do that to women in like TV commercials, right? Like the housemaid would be that's all women would do, right? They would take care of the kids. They would just make meals for the men coming back from work, right? So I feel like maybe we're looking at like a little bit of a shift, So maybe that's why we're doing this, but I feel like we should have a balance, like
So, I have a 6-year-old daughter who I love, of course, with all my heart. But I think her dad plays such an important role in her life. And, we're different people. And we play such different roles. I noticed, for example, her dad is much more, how shall I say, a joker. He's just funnier. He comes up with jokes that no one would ever think about. So they love each other's company. They're always laughing and goofing off and roughhousing with the dog. Whereas, I'm just more serious. And so I'm always working with her on reading. We just contribute different things. I think when the father, back in the 40s and the 50s, when the father was, hiding off in work, just trying to help the family make ends meet, because they were, right, the ideal was a single family, a single figure earner, single parent earner. The child just had one parent, right? For all intents and purposes, it was the mom who was the caretaker and the dad was absentee. That hurts not only the kid, but I do think it hurts the father. I mean, think about what kind of life you have when you're so disconnected from your family. Isn't that the whole point? I mean, going back to what Jake was saying.
I think so, but I do want to give a little bit of a defense for Homer Simpson. So he works. I just want to give. I can't show the picture because this is just an audio-only show. But in the show, he works at a nuclear facility, and there's a sign right in front of him. He works at this big panel, a bunch of lights and colored buttons and things like that, and there's a framed picture that says, "Don't forget you're here forever." But what Homer Simpson does is he takes pieces of paper and covers it up. So it says, "Do it for her."
Oh,
and then in his mind, it shows him, I think I'm remembering this correctly, it shows him like visualizing his youngest daughter, Maggie.
Oh.
And so, I mean, he's definitely being subjected to something that he doesn't want to do, but I think he's making something good out of it.
Okay. Yeah, but I think this is important because this is all about the gender dynamics. He still experiences his life as being subordinated. And I think, it's unfortunate that Maggie doesn't have more time with her dad. If you ask her, do I want some, big thing that you can buy me, going back to Jake's point, maybe say a new, I don't know, what do kids like now? Nintendos? I don't know.
Phones, I think.
Okay, phone. I want $1,000 phone. It would be better for, I'm sure she would prefer time with him.
Yeah, and I mean, when you ask anyone that has seen The Simpsons, like, what's the personality of Homer Simpson? I mean, it's a lazy person. You have your you have your cherry picking of like a couple of shows where like they show this humane person of him, and maybe it's the evolution of the show. How like, okay, we've been doing this for 20 years. Maybe Homer Simpson can be smart on this show, or like family caring. But
for this one episode,
yeah, for this one episode, you'll be a good father. But it's not just that. I mean, just this Super Bowl, when you were watching like the funny TV commercials, I mean, you have the father that has no idea how. I think it was a McDonald's ad actually, and it was this dad where like the mother was on a work trip, and he didn't know how to handle his family. Mm-hmm. So he went into McDonald's for their new like $1, $2, $3 deal. Like get a bunch of food for like the cheapest thing possible, and that way you can finally, as a man, provide for your family, And to me, like, that angers me because I feel like we're teaching our kids that men are not, I guess, a family figure that you can depend on. Like all they're there for is just sometimes to play catch with you. You know what I mean?
And to push things around. Here's your McDonald's meal.
Yes, like I don't understand why our society likes to do that, but.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. But do you think it's something that's going to change, though? Because one of the things that an article that you turned us on to, that you shared with us when we talked to you originally, was how gender identity is changing in the U.S., and the article is actually from a magazine that I read quite often, Teen Vogue.
Oh, yeah, right.
So it said that nearly 3% of 9th and 11th graders they consider themselves to be non-gender conforming or transgendered. So it combines them both. And do you think with this number increasing from previous years, previous generations, do you think that's going to change the way that families are structured with their parents and how the different roles that way as well?
Well, I think we're definitely seeing some change. That's the interesting part of that. 3% teenagers feeling like they don't have to identify themselves as female or male. In fact, that we can be, what's all of these terms, transgender, gender variant, gender nonconforming, you know,
Right.
gender neutral. I mean, all of these possibilities exist is fascinating, because if on the one hand what we're fed by media is a sort of constrained possibility of being a man or being a father, right?
Yep.
These kinds of ideas offer us so many more choices, and I think that's really exciting for youth. I think that you guys really, I know we talked about the death of the American dream, and there's a lot of, you know, problems that we need to think through, including, you know, patriarchy and gender inequality, but this is really exciting that people have new ideas about who they are and who they can be, that these kinds of questions come up. I mean, when I was a kid, I never thought it was possible to be a man, or, you know, those were my two
Right.
choices.
Right.
Now we have more than, you know, endless choices. So that's kind of exciting, I think. What do you guys think?
I mean, yeah. I think the more choices there are available for you. Well, I shouldn't say available. I mean, every
In the
year.
catalog, right?
Yeah, in the what should I be today?
Let's
No,
sit for that one.
I feel like the more open we are as a society, the better.
Yeah.
And it goes with not just gender, but anything else in the work field, in
People
school.
having more
Yeah.
choice. Yeah.
Yeah, the more choices, the better. I don't understand what's this like conservative prerogative that people want to. I think people are afraid. I think people are afraid of talking about these kinds of issues. You know, they're used to living a certain way, and they don't like change. Change scares them.
Yeah.
And maybe we should approach these people with how change, with like a seminar, I guess, of how like a change is not always bad, you know? Like as a society, I mean, just look at nature. I mean, nature evolves with time, and I feel like our minds and our culture, our society should change with it as well.
But then you say nature changes with time, and you got me worrying about climate change. You know, so sometimes change doesn't really work. I mean, there's, like you talked about, backlashes, certainly,
Right,
you know?
right.
And when people are anxious about change, unfortunately, you have a lot of people acting out.
But I think that's why you have backlashes, when you're not used to change, and then something suddenly just changes quickly on you, and you get mad and angry. So then there's this big backlash. But if we kind of like, I don't know, somehow come up with like a way where we can moderately change with through time without having like, I guess, rapid. Like I feel like those rapid changes are triggered by people not wanting the change. So I feel like we have to like.
Maybe in terms of gender, yeah.
Right. We have to quickly like show them what we're all about, you know, instead of like progressively going through stages. But yeah, I feel like we could talk about gender identity
and change
and
itself,
for
you know.
like
So
hours.
I'm teaching a class in social problems, and yesterday, I can't believe it's yesterday, so much happens in 24 hours. But we were talking about Michelle Alexander's book. I don't know if you guys have seen it, The New Jim Crow. And her argument in The New Jim Crow is how we've, in fact, reproduced racial control, right? White domination over African American subordination since slavery. And she talks about how these are not only institutionalized at one moment, but how they get reinstitutionalized historically, such that here we are in this moment supposedly of, right, racial equality? But no, in fact, the majority of not the majority, but disproportionate representation of African American and Latinos in prison is to some extent explained by the way, actually by a large extent, by the way we've set up policies around who should be policed, right? We were talking about this beginning of the conversation. Who should be policed, how they should be policed, they should be prosecuted.
Right.
I mean, think of all of the racial profiling cases across the country. That's not in a vacuum, in fact, ties into a whole criminal justice system. So when we talk about change, and we talk about that backlash, you know, sometimes we think things are changing, and in fact, they're not.
Well, on the topic of change, I've noticed that I think this term came up in like early 2000s, but I feel like it's picked up pace. Latinx.
Oh yeah, Latinx.
Latinx. So talking about change, what's your take on that particular change within the Latino community of like, I guess, identifying themselves with that term instead of Latino or Latina?
I think it's high time. You know, as a feminist, I feel like, you know, there's been a large group of Latinos in and outside of academia who've been trying to push the Latinos to have real conversations about gender inequality and sexual inequality for a long time. So Latinx represents an attempt to recognize people who feel they're beyond this gender binary. You know, they're no longer, or they're not, or maybe they never were Latino or Latina. In fact, they're gender neutral, or they're beyond male, female. So they're Latinx, and I totally applaud that. I think that's great. I think it really pushes us to question why we assume that you have to be on one side of the divide in order to be okay, in order to be part of this community. In fact, our community can be inclusive of all kinds of gender expressions.
Right. I know when I was researching about the term, I know, like, from what I've gathered, the biggest, like, I guess, argument against it within the Latino community would be that it would destroy the Spanish language.
Yeah, and there's so many great arguments out there about people who are woke, right? About how ridiculous this is. Because, think about it. In Mexico right now, we have over 126 languages. So, this conversation about Spanish being what defines us or brings our community together is, to me, come on, really? Mm-hmm. This is an imposition from Spain. There's plenty of Latino exes in the United States who don't even speak Spanish.
Right.
There's plenty of Latino immigrants who, never spoke Spanish. They speak an indigenous language and they're learning English. Are we going to say they're not Latino because they don't speak Spanish? Ridiculous.
Right. Yeah, you're right. So, I guess what if you were writing about a certain type of Latino community, and you were writing a paper on them, which term would you prefer using? Would you prefer using Latinx or?
Well, this is the concern I have. I think if you look at the history of this quote-unquote Latino identity as a word, right, it has, for all of its life been associated with business interests. Right? It's been associated with marketing. And so Arlene Davila writes this great book, Latinos Inc., about how Latinos as activists, right, intellectuals, people who struggle, people who worked in the fields, right, who died too early from cancers, we all imbued what it meant to be Latino with a real meaning. But when things get reproduced by the media, right, by Sony or whatever multinational corporation, it loses that meaning. And so I think a lot of the ways Latino has been reproduced is for that kind of celebrity, I don't know, crossover pop artists. It doesn't have any of the history that informed the way it emerged. And sometimes I think the way Latinx is deployed is similar. It's a sort of commodification of Latino identity without really understanding where it comes from.
Right.
And I think it's just too facile. We look to reproduce things easily and quickly without understanding the complexities of our populations.
So do you think the term is used more for marketing purposes rather than to, like, if you were to read that, would you just think of, like, the current issues involving that word, or would you think of the entire, like, cultural history that lies behind it?
As a Latina, I think about all of the cultural issues that underlie it, but I just think that we're using Latinx too easily and not bringing all that history with it. So, for example, there are a lot of people who are saying Latinx should apply not just to people who feel that they're beyond the gender binary, but we should all call ourselves Latinx. And as a feminist, who recognizes the very real challenges Latinas face as women, right? I feel that's a real dismissal, that's a real snub, that's a real erasure of our struggle. And so I have a problem when media just reproduces Latinx without recognizing the privileges that O's have relative to white society, fine, but also the subordination that Latinas face simultaneous to the kinds of real discrimination that Latinxs experience. But I don't think it's a competition, We shouldn't throw ourselves all together as if we have the same experience. The point of Latinos, I think, all of this conversation about borders and, black majority city, white suburbs, is the fact that we're a very rich community. And what we do, what I think are real, I don't know. I mean, I guess if we could sort of remove myself from my hat as a professor and think about myself as a Latina, just a person, just a Latina who lives in the world, one of the biggest things that I remember was, translating for my mom who couldn't speak any English. And, it's kind of awkward to be a kid because who's translating for your parent, because your parent's supposed to be in charge. And all of a sudden you feel all this responsibility. But that's where I really started to realize the power of Latinos in this country. We're translators, right? We're linguistic translators, we're gender translators, we're border translators, we're social translators. We have a real, I don't want to say responsibility, but real potential, to be translators, including in this sort of, in the problematics that is gender. But I don't think you can do that by dismissing the real power of patriarchy and just saying, Latinx, we're all Latinx now. Woohoo!
One thing that I stumbled upon while reading about the Latinx issue in Mexico specifically is that in pre-Spanish colonial times, there was the Zapotec culture, which actually recognized a third gender.
Yeah, I think that's so. Go ahead.
I don't know how to say it, so I might need one of your helps.
I got you, Jake.
M-U-X-E?
Talking about translating.
Mushe.
Yeah, the mushe.
Yep.
But here's the thing, there's third gender, and this is the really important thing, because to say third gender is not the same thing as saying beyond the gender divide, right? We only have one X, but it doesn't explain those two very different experiences of gender, one that is a third gender and one that is beyond gender. You see what I'm saying? So we lose all of that exciting debate, I think, that we can have around what the O and the A and the third gender and the X could mean, because we're conflating it all together. Personally, I feel like we're trying to ignore gender variance by just, let's just put an X on it, simplify it. I guess maybe for my generation, if you were gay, you weren't allowed to talk about it. So you could be gay, and we could all know that your friend, let's say, and sorry, Ruben, but let's say your friend Jake is your boyfriend, but we won't talk about it. He's just your friend.
They were not
so
on
you
the air.
couldn't talk about it.
Yeah.
And I guess my concern, or maybe my anxiety, is that the X represents more of the same. We're just going to put an X on it so we don't have to talk about it.
Okay, I see what you mean. Yeah. So, I guess what the challenge is, how can we come up with a term that represents the culture, the history behind everything, and at the same time, we can talk about it?
Well, I like Latino X. That's my preference, because I still feel I'm just, from my position, right? I still feel recognized as a Latina, and I'm still being invited into a dialogue about privilege and subordination and gender dynamics with the O and the X. I know that a lot of people are doing different things. Some people are, doing Lat.
I think I agree with you with that term. I mean, the people that make the argument about the Spanish language, I mean, yes, I understand Spanish is part of our culture and our history, but I feel like they're just trying to pick away anything that goes against like changing, including everyone else. I can't remember the other argument that I saw. Oh yeah, the other argument is about the Latina OX term is that it's too lengthy.
Yeah,
It's like,
and that's the media, what I'm talking about. Like, why,
it's not beautiful enough, right?
we're supposed to accommodate. It's the question. It's subordinating ourselves, right, to language. Like this is a problem that I'd be an O or an A, right?
Right.
So now I should just be an X to make it easier for you, to make it more comfortable for you.
Yeah. That's a good point.
As a sociologist, do you study gender in terms of biology at all? Do you just stick to?
No, you kidding me? That's for biologists. That's not my area of specialty. I don't think I even did well in biology.
That's interesting, because but do you consider it to have both biological and like social influences on the way we view gender, or do you view it as just a construction? Or
I mean, I obviously recognize there's hormones. I obviously recognize there's genitalia. I recognize there's unspecific genitalia, what we used to call, I think we still call them intersex,
Yeah.
people who are born,
With a variance of both genitalia.
right. And some that can be, the physician living in a patriarchal society will encourage parents, to have an immediate surgery as soon as the child is born. And see, that's the reason why we need the O. We need to recognize that patriarchy, right? When an intersex child is born, more often than not, they're encouraged, I think, to make them female. So, the problematic should be feminized. And I think these are conversations that we need to be having. But you see, I can't really talk about the hormones of it or the sort of structural features of it. I can just talk about why is it that most physicians are choosing to feminize intersex, to have surgery right after birth. Why is that the important thing? Why is that such a problem for society?
I think I read somewhere that unfortunately we live in a capitalistic country, so I think the procedure is easier to just remove the male genitalia.
But remember, when we're talking about options, why can't we have both genitalia?
Right, exactly. So I guess the question is who decides what and when, right? Because just like with the topic of abortion,
Yeah.
But I guess that's a little bit different because the option is always should be the woman which should have the right to choose what to do with her body. But in this case, it's a little bit different because the right should be given to the child that's born.
Well, the child is already born, right? This is the
This is
point.
the different,
child
yeah.
is now,
So the
exists.
I mean, unless it's like life threatening,
I have never heard of a case.
you should leave. You should leave both until the kid is old enough to decide for themselves what they want to identify as.
And when
right?
we say that, that's really interesting because you say when they're old enough to identify for themselves, and we have to
and not
render-
putting social pressure when they're old. When they decide to be old enough to decide,
So
that should be
So Foucault writes this book, very interesting, about a case back in, I want to say maybe it was the 1800s. I don't remember. I read it when I was a grad student, so don't hate me, but it's a long time ago. And when you read this person's diary, they were born intersex, and they weren't operated on, you really see the complexity that is, right? This real struggle with gender, because at one point, this person felt that they were female. But they aged, and I don't know how puberty works. I don't know how hormones work. But as they aged, then they felt that they were a male. I want to suggest the possibility that our gender identity may change over time.
I think it's encoded in our DNA. I remember watching this documentary about this psychologist, Dr. Money, and the documentary is The Boy with No Penis. So we have an intersex child, and the parents decided to remove the male genitalia, and they got together with a psychologist, and the psychologist, so the kid would meet up with the psychologist like every single day of the week, and the psychologist would, I guess you could say, try to convince the kid that
It was a boy.
A girl, right? And it got to a point where like it's just in our bodies. It's how we're made up. Is like you can't just convince someone to be a gender by psychology. That was the experiments.
Yeah.
Can you tell someone since they're a little kid that they're gonna be a female for the rest of their lives? And it turns out you can't. And it ended up being a tragic story where like they committed suicide because you have all this social pressure and all that stuff to be someone that you're not, right?
Yeah.
But on a lighter, mood,
We've been going up and down this whole conversation. Oh, that's
Emotional
great.
we have ice cream with us today.
Oh, yay. That's exactly what we needed. Just
right. we kind of forgot to do this at the beginning of the show, but it's okay. It's our show. We can do
but I
whatever
get
we
vanilla
want.
bean, right?
Yes. So the name of the show is Sobremesa. So to our non-Spanish speakers out there, Sobremesa is used, at least I think in the Mexican culture, as over-the-table talk. So after you're done eating your meal, instead of going and starting another activity, you basically don't do any physical activity, and then you just kind of talk about what happened in your day or what's going on around the world. So that's the whole purpose of the show, is kind of like break down that bridge between that setting of being in an office with your professor, and just talking business.
I love it.
This is more of just, what, we're at a coffee shop, we're having a normal conversation just like any other person would be having. And then we end every segment or every show with a segment where we eat dessert and then just kind of talk about lighter topics.
Like how delicious this vanilla bean ice cream is.
Oh yeah,
It's funny. I don't really like vanilla, but I love vanilla bean. Something about the vanilla beans that make it more tasty.
What's
I gotta read the ingredients. I don't know enough about vanilla beans to talk about that.
Well, actually, I'm sure if we study them, there's like a horrible traffic, that precedes the vanilla bean.
But this is a lighter topic. So.
These are fair traded vanilla beans.
What university did you study at?
I went to University of Michigan. Funny enough, right down the street.
Okay, Ann Arbor.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Never heard of that one.
The Flint
Well,
was
what's
the big
really
one.
funny to me, is that who would have thought? I'm from New York, and I really love New York. It's part of my DNA. So I went to graduate school, and then I went back to New York, and then I came back to Michigan. It's funny. I think a lot of people have this feeling that Michigan kind of like seeps into your body and puts a hold on you. Doesn't let you get away. Every time I try to get out, they put me back in.
So, do you like living in Michigan? Would you rather
I
live in
do.
a
I
big
gotta
city?
say, especially with my daughter, every time we go to New York, we go because family. Gotta see the family. But how nice is it to be able to drive up to a supermarket and park, and be able to shop without having to dodge tons of people? I love it. And we can go hiking, and I'm not competing with 300 people on the trail. It's just so much more peaceful.
Right. For me, I just hate the cold weather. I can't get used to it.
Especially now with aren't you elated that it's so warm outside then?
If by warm you mean 25 degrees, yes.
Well, all my snow melted, so
New snow melted, yeah. No, honestly, you're right. When it's like 25 or 30 degrees out and it's sunny, it feels like it's 80 outside for me. Like, it's a happy day in Ruben's world.
That was the name of our other show.
Oh, right. Like, what was that show? Do you remember with
Wayne's
the boys?
World.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Huge influence to the show.
So what do you guys like to do? What are your big hobbies? Anything related to the snow? You do any snowmobiling, cross-country skiing?
He does snowboarding, right?
Skiing.
Skiing.
That's why he was silent when you were hating on the winter.
Yeah, he loves it. He loves X Games and all that stuff.
If there was no skiing, I wouldn't really like the winter that much. But I think it makes me appreciate the spring and the summer a lot more, as dumb as that sounds.
No, that makes total sense.
He's a corny guy.
But yeah, I like skiing, hiking, like you said, that you like, and video games. Like,
Do they have any sports? I mean, I don't know because I'm not a real sports person. I confess, I spend more time, in the library than outside. But anyway, I've always wanted to snowshoe, and I feel like that's something that should happen, here in Michigan. Does Wayne have any, clubs where you could
I think
go
we have
and
a
learn how to
sledding
snowshoe?
club, right?
a sledding club?
Yeah, I think so.
I've never been. I didn't get an invite.
I'm pretty sure we have a sledding club. I don't. We probably have we have like what, over 100 or 200 organizations here. I'm sure one of them is probably something to do with winter sports. I think it's. I know we're talking about lighter topics, but that's definitely another thing about how like only rich families or rich kids probably have more access to
Of course.
winter sports than
Yeah, and think about how
inner city
expensive it is
families.
to ski. Oh my God, the cost of even renting skis, plus the boots, plus the lift ticket, plus you need your pants, right? Oh my God, yeah, it's ridiculous.
Yep.
And it's also it's funny because I wonder if all the people who ski love to ski or if they ski just to show off their wealth. I can't help but wonder if that's part of
I think a little bit of both, probably. Right, Jake?
The hill that I ski on most frequently is used to be a landfill, so I'm not showing off much.
I'm surprised that we don't use some of our grounds to do things like sledding. Can't we build a nice hill on the grounds? And
I remember I went sledding one time and it was a lot of fun. All right, next topic.
I think you guys should think about interviewing someone who knows about all these clubs, so that the readers. I mean, I want to find out. I don't know what I can do in terms of social activities, and I feel like I should make time for that.
Yeah.
More
definitely.
socializing with students. This was a really great conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thank you for.
And in
coming.
class, you guys can empathize. When you're in a classroom setting, you're so focused on the material you need to cover rather than, let's just, what's the word? I don't want to use this word. Just chat.
Converse.
Yeah.
You can use it. It's okay.
I think it's because there's so much of a time limit to get through a lot of material
Yeah.
that just people are a little too anxious, a little too busy to stop and do
This
things
is
like
what
that.
you were saying, Jake, right? We want to live in a different way, not just always being so focused on a particular objective and a particular goal. That's like how I live every single day. What do I have to do at 8? What do I have to do at 9? At 9:15, I have to do this. Don't forget to do that.
I
We
think
need
that's how
to
we're
loosen up a
programmed,
little.
right? This everything. There's prerequisites that you have to meet for everything. There's
Yeah.
a certain deadlines that you have to meet by the end of the week or stuff like that. Honestly, I don't. From my perspective as Mexican, I don't know why Americans. Maybe I'm overgeneralizing here, but I don't know why Americans are so afraid to talk to their professors after class. Honestly, from all my biology, chemistry courses, I've noticed that it's the foreigners that talk most with the professors
Really?
after class
Interesting.
than the white people. Yeah, and I don't know what. Maybe you can talk a little bit more about that. What anxiety Americans feel.
Well, but now we're treating it as if it's real. I mean, maybe it's
Oh
not.
no, it's just from my experience that I've noticed that in school. I don't know.
I think it's pretty true. I studied abroad for a little while, and I noticed that the people that I studied with in Brazil, the distance between the professor and the students was much smaller, as in like,
Interesting.
you know, like what they consider themselves to be socially. So like they could converse with each other. One didn't see themselves as like a doctor, and you'll never be a professor like me.
Interesting. That cultural difference was
culture.
less. But then I must say, I was talking to someone last week. Her father was a professor in Bangladesh, and she was saying that, you know, part of the reason, I think what might explain it is that professors don't have much social status, you know, in Bangladesh. So the reason I guess students feel more comfortable talking to their professors because professors don't matter, and I really feel like professors don't have the kind of status they should have in the United States. You know, that they should, like they have, for example, in France. I think French culture really reveres professors for the kinds of cultural innovation and cultural insight, cultural enrichment they offer the nation. I think that, you know, in the United States we have a lot of anxiety about intellect. And so it's something that we tend to reject. You know that, what was his name, Alan Bloom? He talked about media, the dumbing of U.S. society. I don't remember the name of the book. It was like in the 80s. But anyway, see? No. Alzheimer's, early onset.
But I think for like non-foreigners, I guess people that are from this area that go to Wayne State, what might be stopping a lot of them from getting to know the professors and like not having such a big distance between them socially is probably because a lot of people that are from here, not a lot of their parents went to college, so they don't.
Oh, yeah, good point.
Like my parents didn't go to college. I mean, my dad did a couple of years at Garfield Hall University, Macomb Community College.
Yeah, and I'm first generation too, and it's true. It's funny that you mentioned that because I was very, you know, when I went to talk to my professors, it was like, oh, you know, this was a very big thing, and I would prepare myself. What was I going to say? And you know, you definitely felt there was sort of a cultural divide there, you know, class-based, but.
Yeah, I think if you went to somewhere like the East Coast or maybe even the West Coast, you might find that, you know, places where more people have been going to college for more generations, it might not have such a divide.
Mm-hmm. I think it's the way professors. I mean, it's probably not in like your field, but there's this thing where like if you do research, in order for you to do research at a university, they require you to teach for at least once or twice a week, right? So I don't know if that's true in like every field, but I know it's true for the chemistry and biology department at least. So I don't know if maybe that's why we don't have so many good professors in those fields in contrast with like sociology. All my best professors I've had at this institution have been like in the social sciences or like, and I don't know if it's because of the topic. Like it's more of like a topic that you can kind of like converse a lot about instead of like molecules and stuff like that. But I don't know. Have you noticed that, Jake? Where like I feel like professors in the natural sciences feel like they have to lecture, so maybe they don't really are passionate about it than rather than social sciences professors.
I think so.
Good.
But I think that the more empirical the field gets, I think the more the professors feel like, you know, there's less room for, you know, like personal experience in teaching and things like that. And if you get to things more like political science or sociology, there's, you know, those are inherently related to the way people act and the way people interact.
Yeah.
So I think they value that much more, like talking about their own experiences and things like that.
See, I think that the goal was really shared, regardless of whether you were in the physical sciences or the social sciences or the humanities. The idea was you work with students because it's the teaching that propels you on in your research, right? You have hypotheses, you test them out with your students learn through the process of doing research with you. It's supposed to be a symbiotic relationship.
A biology term. I thought you.
Oh, see, probably
I thought you didn't know biology. Who are you? All right. I think that pretty much ends our show today, right, Jake?
Yeah, that's about it.
Well, thank you so much for inviting me. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you for being here. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you so much for coming.
Yeah, I think who's our next guest for next week, Jake?
Dr. Eric Ash from the History Department.
Oh, that'll be a fun one too.
Well, I'll be listening because now that I see the project that you guys have, I'm totally all about it.
Yeah, cool.
We got to publicize this more among students and
Yeah,
professors. This is
definitely.
really a great way to build, campus culture. I love it. I applaud what you guys are doing.
Thank you.
Well,
So
thank you.
we'll be here next Friday at the same time, 11 in the morning, 11 to 12, right?
That's right.
All right. Cool.
And we'll all tune in.
Yep.
Okay, take care.
Good night.